This entry into the history of financial futures is sponsored by Eurex.
The exchanges were, in theory, already being regulated by the CEA. There was absolutely no resources devoted to that at all. Old Mr. Caldwell, all he could do was put out a press release. So I think that there was as much impetus based on what might be going on the floors, undetected, as there was, From that, it spread out, saying, well, what about Billy Sol Estes? What about the guy out there with the salad oil scandal? So the impetus in the beginning was the exchanges, and they were powerful, and they were not used to being told what to do, and they were very, very anti-regulation. And they were the firms said, tell us what the rules are, and we'll figure out how to make money under the rules. And so we got a lot more help from the firms than we did from the exchanges. The exchanges would have, in their happiest moment, killed the legislation altogether. That was all part of the negotiation. I mean, everybody believed that you can't regulate people that you don't know. So there was a requirement that you had to be, identified as an entity, so that the regulators knew precisely who they were talking to and what they were doing. But that wasn't controversial, as I recall. The controversial stuff really had to do with, first of all, how many commissioners? I argued that there wasn't going to be work. There wasn't going to be enough work for 5 commissioners, and that would be a burden on the taxpayer. And why don't we just give 3 commissioners? 3 commissioners can make a decision just as easily and maybe more easily than 5. And that did not make it into the final legislation because Rainbolt, who had been helpful in every other way, knew that he had an eye on one of those slots and was pretty sure if it was just 3, he might not get the job. And the first chairman was unsuccessful candidate for comptroller who needed a job. And he didn't know what a futures contract was, but he knew Nelson Rockefeller's staff assistant. And Rockefeller had just become the vice president. And John Veneman was his name, whose daughter later became Secretary of Agriculture. And he said, my friend Bill out in California is a real bright guy, and I think he should be the chairman of the CFTC. And Nelson Rockefeller went in to see Jerry Ford and said, we got a candidate, a guy that needs to be taken care of. We're going to make Bill the chairman of the CFTC. And he was a lot of fun. And he was, flamboyant and loud. And he said, nothing's better for this industry than to have somebody that has no preconceived notions, has no experience, has no loyalty to any particular side, and and I will take on this responsibility with energy, and I might add humor, and he could rely on people that were coming over from the Department of Agriculture in the old CEA days, and Rainbolt basically appointed himself as vice chairman. So, the earliest days of the CFTC, there was a chairman and a vice chairman, and then 3 commissioners. Dan Rostenkowski, was one that was certainly helpful to his constituents, bringing home the bacon. Tom Foley was one who was smart and listened, and he went on to be speaker, but he was chairman of the Ag Committee after Bob Pogue. Ed Madigan from Illinois, who's not with us anymore. I think he was from Bloomington or Lincoln. He was smart and took an interest in it because he knew that he had a lot of farmer constituents, that depended on these markets, for managing risk. And we spent a lot of time educating other members of the committee. I'll tell you another one was Dan Glickman. Glickman was a Kansas farm boy. No, he wasn't a farm boy, but he had a lot of farm constituents. His father, I think, ran a lumber yard or something, but he had been an SEC staff attorney when he got out of law school. So he understood the concepts. And Richard Lugar had a farm. Chuck Grassley, when he got there, he had a farm. He understood that you didn't have to be a farmer who used the markets, but you had to be a farmer who understood that your local grain elevator was the place that was making your price every day, and that grain elevator could only give you a price if they knew how to use the market. So there was a huge input, from the agricultural section. Cattle guys from Texas, Kika de la Garza, when he became a member, took an unusual interest in the futures markets. He ended up going from being very junior to being a chairman of the committee. If you went to Lugar and you explained to Lugar, why it was necessary to do this or that, and it made sense to him. He was a Rhodes Scholar, and I knew him when he was mayor of Indianapolis, so we had a good relationship, and Walt was working for him. I think there was another guy who went on to run a foundation. I always thought it was the greatest job in the world, run a foundation for the Eli Lilly family. All he had to do was give away money, but he was Walt's predecessor, and Lugar was honest and bright and anxious to do the right thing. We don't have a lot of those guys left. So Lugar would help us on the Senate side. Dole would always help. Well, the FIA came into being in 1955, and it came into being, and it was kind of a
New York broker.
It was New York broker. There was a luncheon club. These guys would, they would celebrate by taking trips around the island in a boat and once a year, and they'd get together and they'd talk about things that were, of interest. And maybe, if they had a particular issue with Congress, if a congressman from New York came home, a delegation would go visit him in his office. But there was really no Washington representation for the exchanges, for the firms. And a guy named John Claggett ran the FIA. And I replaced John Claggett in 1982. And John Claggett was responsible for moving the FIA from New York to Washington. But he wasn't really a Washington person, He really enjoyed, he probably fought the process. He probably thought he could do it out of and he'd come from Beige, so he'd had some firm experience. And I think that Beige wasn't as involved in futures then. So, here was a good guy, and they said, let's put old John in charge of this, luncheon club that we've got. And he was the wrong guy, for coming to Washington. And I remember being one of the candidates to replace, and Conini used to remind me, he said, well, don't be too cocky. He said the other guys were all a bunch of bums. Anybody could have beat them. I think his expression was, becoming the next head of the FIA was like winning the taller than Mickey Rooney award or something like that. But anyway, it was a good run for me, and I lived through a lot of that. The early days at the FIA really were more about establishing the FIA as a Washington organization. And I had lots of old friends from the White House that had spread out into different positions in the town. So we would give a big Christmas party, and more and more people learned about the FIA. And then our first real test was the first reauthorization. And the reauthorization really wasn't designed to make any substantive changes. We'd all worked hard to come up with what we came up with. But every reauthorization was more to make sure that the industry was reminded that there were members of Congress that were new and hadn't been there at the beginning, or that had been there in the beginning, but they all had races to run, and it wasn't getting any cheaper, to run a congressional race or a Senate race. And then and now, members of Congress relied on people who were their friends to help them raise money, so that they could. And Futures is a perfect example. Without a trade association to help the members, particularly the new members, many of whom came from cities, not farmland, and had no real understanding about futures at all. The lobbying that we did was much more educational than it was arm twisting. They wanted to do the right thing, and they just needed to know what was the right thing and why was this the right thing to do. So a lot of it was education and building a level of trust so that you could go to them and say, this is a good idea and here's why it's a good idea. And they didn't have to become experts, and they many times didn't have to hire a staffer, that was steeped in the but many of the staffers got kind of interested in the subject matter. Walt Lucan being a perfect example, saying, this is an interesting area, and and I've got a career to think of, after Senator Lugar's no longer the senator, and becoming a commissioner, is a good path. The exchanges and the firms could agree on one thing, and that is we do not want bigger and more powerful government agencies. We think a self-regulatory agency where we will have more impact because we will fund it and we will have some authority over who is, in charge is a good idea. And I give Leo a lot of credit because Leo is the one that, sort of organized the earliest meetings on what should this organization look like. And naturally, Leo figured out a way for the firms to pay for most of it. And that's still the case. But on the theory that the exchanges had their own self-regulatory organization inside, so they shouldn't have to have much to do with the NFA. But I, Leo Melamed, should be the person to run it. So I'll be the chairman, and then we will know that it's run properly. When Leo tried to make a strong argument for his re-election after maybe one or two, I think the firm said, because we all love Leo, they made the argument that Leo, we're paying for this organization. And therefore, our man John Conheeney, who's a giant and a legend in the business, will be the next chairman. And Leo is not in a position to challenge that. Things since then, have been chairmen that have been primarily from the banking and FCM community. And it's been a very well-run organization. And it's had its crises, it's had its emergencies, but by and large, the leadership over there has been very solid, and that continues today. It was really designed to relieve the CFTC and to be able to substantiate the argument that the CFTC didn't have to be bigger and more money and didn't have to have a bigger budget, etc., because much of the work would be done by the self-regulatory organizations, whether it was the NFA or whether it was the exchanges themselves. Gary Gensler was out to prove to 2 or 3 of the members of the Senate that he wasn't just a Goldman Sachs yes man. So he leaned over backwards to really stick it to Goldman. I don't know what they did to Goldman to get rid of him, but they did the right thing. And he ended up at the CFTC, and we would work with the CFTC to talk about things that made the most sense in terms of modernizing the regulatory structure. And our ideas were different, and sometimes we would compromise and agree and shake hands, and sometimes, we would go make our arguments. But he kind of, under the cover of darkness the night before, kind of walked away from all the understandings that we felt we had, and convinced the woman from Arkansas who was the chairman of the Senate Ag Committee, and who didn't really understand futures very well, but became very dependent upon Gary Gensler, and did her a lot of good. She got beat the next election, so she could thank Gary Gensler for that, in my judgment. But other than Gary Gensler, it wasn't a really partisan job. We had good chairmen from the Democratic side. We had good chairmen from the Republican side. We had some that were more committed than others. We had one, that found the stress to the point where he actually had to take a 6-week leave of absence, because of the stress. But he wasn't a bad chairman. He just wasn't psychologically equipped to listen to Tom Donovan scream at him, So by and large, the agency has operated extremely well, and it's fostered quite a lot of growth in our markets. I'm personally very proud of the fact that we trade more equity products notional value-wise in Chicago than we do in New York. And that one of my guys bought the New York Stock Exchange, and there were a lot of people that used to tease me about, you're in the commodity business? You mean pork bellies and that stuff? Jesus Christ. Now I can say to them, yeah, the commodity guys, are now in charge. We're trading more equity products and more dollar value in stocks and bonds in Chicago than you are with all the New York exchanges put together. Well, in those days, we could get a good number of members of Congress to come down to Boca, including Kika de la Garza. And they would come down, and they love coming down here. We'd always, in March, you're ready to get out of Washington. So they would come down in droves, and the exchanges and the FIA would sort of split the cost. We'd bring them all down, we'd give them $1,000, we'd take them to play golf, and we'd line them up 10 at a time, and they each had about 30 seconds because they wanted to get through what they had to say. But they ended up with a nice feeling towards the people who were being nice to them. And it's illegal now. Somebody decided that, we were polluting their minds. The truth is, a lot of them came down here that didn't play golf and would single out people in the business and say, I want to learn more about this. I want to understand, how this. Boehner was a perfect example of a guy that played golf, but also spent a fair amount of time understanding how our markets work. And I mentioned Glickman. I should mention Boehner as a congressman that was very helpful as well, especially as they became more important. And then there was one from Iowa, Berkeley Bedell. And Berkeley Bedell was not helpful. And he was from a farm district, but he made his money selling fishing rods and reels. And Berkeley was probably among the wealthier members of at least the Iowa delegation. And it turned out that one day the Justice Department found out that Berkeley was importing all his stuff from China, but to avoid paying the fee, he was bringing them in through Canada, which he thought was pretty clever. And the minute the Justice Department cracked down on him, I think Berkeley might have done, he might have done 6 months in the Hooskow. So that helped us get rid of somebody that was not helpful at all. No, we had good guys on the Ag Committee, but the Ag Committee at a time was one of the real important committees of Congress because every state had some form of agriculture. So you could be on the Ag Committee and count on the fact that there would be even Rhode Island, maybe even Delaware. I don't know about Alaska, but they had fishing up there, right? So there was always a reason for people to be on the Ag Committee. And then as our markets became more financial, the Ag Committee became less of a draw for some of these people. Freddie Richmond was a member of the Ag Committee, and he saw the Ag Committee as a place where he could bargain for for a little log rolling on more generous food stamp distribution, because the Ag Committee had both the oversight of the futures markets and the food stamp and the school lunch program. So there's still a little bit of that going on. If those were standalone, they probably wouldn't do as well. The introduction of the S&P, that really got the SEC's attention. And Phil Johnson was at CFTC, and John Shad was at the SEC. And to this day, the old guard of the SEC, their alums, say John Shad gave away the farm by letting Phil Johnson say, well, if it's a stock on an individual, if it's a futures contract on an individual stock, we will share jurisdiction. But if it's a futures contract on a mix of stocks, 10 or more, or whatever the statute said, then that remains the exclusive jurisdiction of the CFTC. And exclusive jurisdiction was an issue when we created the CFTC, and it was from the standpoint of the governors saying, we don't need to create, we don't need to find a job for somebody to be the state regulator for, our state security regulator has his hands full. And frequently these guys, in my judgment, were given the job because they were buddies of the governor. It wasn't always a very professional office in most states. And the idea that the states didn't have a very clear understanding of what was involved in the cash equity markets, the idea of having to pass rules and regulations that met with the agreement of the states was ridiculous, and it would have been expensive. So it would have been expensive for the industry, and it would have been expensive for the states, which would have then charged the industry. So exclusive jurisdiction really meant to the states, don't bring cases on violations of the Commodity Exchange Act in state court, because we'll knock you out of that. You do not have the authority to do that. This is a business that is exclusively regulated by a federal agency called the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. And that made a lot of sense to the Republicans. The Democrats in those days were much more powerful at the state level. So the state security commissioners came in at relatively the last moment and said, we think that we should have a voice in this. And there was no sympathy in the Ag Committee for that point of view. They got after it kind of late. The only continuing effort on behalf of the SEC was John Dingell. He honestly believed that, if we were trading equity products, he better be goddamn sure that he's overseeing this. And let's just move the jurisdiction of the CFTC out of the Ag Committee and into Energy and Commerce. I can't remember which year there was a reorganization of the committees in Congress. I think it was 1980 when we took over, when Republicans captured the Senate. We moved it out of Energy and Commerce and gave it to banking, which is where it should have been in the first place. And Dingell did not like that. But that may be one of the only battles that he ever lost. His father had that job for 50 years before he had it, and then he had it for 50 some odd years, and now Debbie, his wife, had it until this year, and she just resigned. But if your name was Dingell and it was on the ballot, you got elected by 90% of the vote.